Well, welcome everybody to episode 22 of the Community Cloudcast. I'm Eric Shupps, joined by my fellow co-host Paul McCollum, and our special guest this month, Ms. Julie Turner.
Welcome.
Hello,
Hello.
Julie.
Thank you.
Paul, can you believe it's been 22 episodes already?
It feels like so many more. No, that's crazy. I didn't even catch that.
Yeah, I know. It's been almost 2 years. Solid. And for those of you who are new to the channel or haven't watched us before, you can join us every month. New episodes of Community Cloudcast air every third Thursday or thereabouts, as close as we can get, on our YouTube channel and on Facebook as well. So you can join us live. You can pop in afterwards, ask questions, and we will do our best to respond. If you have questions for our guests, please leave them. We will forward them on, and we'll get you a response via some magical social media channel somewhere.
So many ways.
You'll get an answer. Speaking of our special guest this month, we are very pleased to be joined by Julie Turner, Microsoft MVP, and with Simpraxis she is based in New England. And are you around the Boston area, or you're north?
Around the Boston area, a little north of that in southern New Hampshire near Portsmouth. So in that general area, but Simpraxis itself is a we all work from home kind of company. So we're not really anywhere. We're everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
And all over the world.
Is that Mark?
One of those friends that I rarely see in the US. It's somewhere in Europe or
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So it's myself and Mark Anderson, who many people are familiar with. And we are also joined. So Mark is actually in Rhode Island. He's moving to Rhode Island officially. And then so it's myself and Mark Anderson and Emily Mancini, who is down in Miami, Florida. Derek Cash Peterson, who is in Iceland officially as his home base, and Todd Clint, who most people know is out in Iowa.
Somewhere in the wilds of Iowa. I think he's in that middle of nowhere dot is right over his house.
Exactly. The dot right over his house. Exactly.
Well, fantastic. So great to be joined by you, Julie. Let's do a little housekeeping, and then we'll jump right into our content for this month. So I want to thank our sponsors, Aptigent. Of course, you can check out Power Tools on Power Platform, Salesforce, Zapier, Nintex, IBM, a whole bunch of platforms they will have out now. And if you want to check out the website, we just launched our Power Connectors and Force Connectors as well, which is custom connector development primarily for Salesforce and Power Platform, but we can work on just about any extensible platform. So lots of stuff happening in the Aptigent space. We will be sponsoring at the upcoming European Collaboration Summit, which Julie, we're going to talk about here in a little bit. So come by and see us if you plan to be in Dusseldorf. And if you don't plan to be in Dusseldorf, change your plans and get your family to Dusseldorf. Because as I pointed out before, the cost of the conference plus the cost of the flight is less than the ticket price for most conferences in the United States. So get your rear end on a plane, get over to Dusseldorf, come, and if nothing else, you can have some schnitzel and beer with Julie and the gang, and myself and everybody else will be making pigs of ourselves over in Germany, as we always do. It's unavoidable. It's Germany, right?
Yeah.
You got to do it. So our topic for this month is tools and techniques for modern workplace application developments, which just is a really big title for saying that we're going to put our developer hats on here and talk some code and bits and bytes for a bit. We have had some podcasts in the past where we've talked more about the end user side or the no-code side of modern workplace apps. So today we're going to dig down and talk more about the developer side of the whole thing. Since Julie and I and Paul are all from developer backgrounds, we can dig our teeth into it and really talk about some dev. So starting from there, Julie, give us a little bit of background on where you come from as a developer and how you came to this journey of now doing a just ton of Office 365 and Azure dev.
Yeah. So I majored in electrical engineering in school, but I'm it's not a minor, but it was a specialization in microprocessor system design. So I was coding. I started coding when I was a small child. I think I was 8 when I started coding and got my first computer. So I've been coding most of my life. And so it was like, oh, I'm going to go into electrical engineering because I wanted to be a sound engineer at Bose, actually. And then, but I was building software on the side to like make money while in college. And then I finally got to my junior year and I was doing a lot of computer science engineering to go with my electrical engineering. And I kind of went, maybe I should just do this computer science thing because it's fun and I already know how to do it. So I sort of finished my degree, but I got a job right away doing software development. And so I kind of, worked my way up the ranks doing software development, managing a software development teams, all enterprise wise type of things. And then I got into an organization and I was the director of IT and realized that maybe I could leverage SharePoint to do some of the, SharePoint on-prem. So it was the 2007 version, excuse me. And I realized that I could use it to manage some of the business processes that we had in our organization. And so I started learning the platform. I hired some consultants and realized that, hey, I could do this, and ended up then switching from being in IT, director of IT type of roles, to being a consultant. And so once I switched to being a consultant, I mean, my dev background was all .NET, C#, well, Visual Basic before that, but we don't talk about those days. And, so C#, .NET, and then, doing consulting on the SharePoint platform, for clients with those skills. And then sort of, I ended up at Blue Metal, which was now purchased by Insight. I'm no longer there, obviously, but met up with Bob German, and he and I sort of kind of started working on the idea that we should really start doing more client-side development when writing our SharePoint solutions to make them more extensible. And then, it kind of went from there. And so I'm more focused on doing client-side development, so TypeScript, JavaScript-based development, but I still dabble in .NET, write some webhooks, services, and such things here and there. So I do some C# still, but mostly write JavaScript, TypeScript these days. So that's my history.
So so I come from a very similar background, in many ways almost identical, and the transition to pure client side, I don't want to say it was an overnight switch, because as you say, we were doing kind of a lot of that stuff anyway, but this whole Node.js kind of tooling stack and whatnot, pretty significant change from what we used to do in the .NET world. So what was your biggest challenge in making that transition?
Getting Node installed.
Yeah, fair.
I just remember Bob got invited to the first dev kitchen that they had for the SharePoint framework, which is, for those who aren't familiar, it's essentially Microsoft invites a bunch of people in the community to come that are MVPs that have, NDA, whatever. And we go out and we sit in a room and we sort of learn about some technology that's coming out and sort of get early hands-on with that technology. And I remember, so Bob was invited. He could bring someone. He brought me. So we went to that dev kitchen, and I remember we couldn't write neither one of us had written TypeScript at that point. So we were only writing JavaScript, and we weren't using like package managers and like Webpack, and any of those tools were just not tools we were using, right? We were writing client-side JavaScript files, but we were just putting them in a script editor or content editor or web part and trying to do our best to make that some sort of ALM around that process, right? Which is where the Widget Wrangler came from, which was an early project where Bob and I basically said, okay, let's take all this code and put it somewhere we can version it and manage it and whatever. But there was no formal build process to any of that. And we were certainly not using NPM.js or any of that stuff. And so when we got there and they're like, hey, you got to have Node, you got to have this, you got to have that. And we're looking at each other going, we don't know how to write TypeScript. We don't have Node installed. We don't even know. We spent like a whole day just trying to get our workstation set up. And I think anybody that was familiar with that stuff, it was like, this is a no-brainer. Yeah, let's get going. But if you were coming from like Visual Studio proper, and your C# and your .NET framework and all that stuff, you were like, what the hell alien workspace did we just walk into?
Well, now let's be fair.
I was Notepad ++ and Ultra Edit.
That's right. There were only
yeah.
3 people in that room. I was at that same early dev
Yes,
kitchen
I
with Julie.
remember. Yeah.
And there were only 3 people in that room that had Node installed, right? It was AC,
Yeah.
Waldeck,
Yeah.
right? And Victor. That was it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say Wickler.
Nobody else had it installed.
And of course, they were running circles around the rest of us.
And of course, so Paul, one of the funny things that came from that is at these dev kitchens, I don't know if they do it anymore. I haven't been to one in a while, but used to have like a little coding challenge hackathon thing for the last day. And so everyone had done this stuff. And of course, Victor, because he's Victor, came up with this wild and crazy thing that just was off the charts. That was cool.
Is that Victor Velan or Victor Chatterburn?
Yeah, Victor
Velan. Okay.
And but that was the dev kitchen where Paul Schaeflein and I wrote the Visual Studio extension for SPFX.
Yep. And that's the thing you demoed. Yeah. It was good.
Yeah. But it's true what you say, because I was passingly familiar with the stuff. I knew a little bit about it just because I have to keep my ear to the ground and some of the other side and whatnot. And I'm pretty sure I had it installed and maybe done a Hello World or something, but I certainly didn't know TypeScript either.
Yeah.
Heard of it, kind of knew what it was, never written a line of it in my life. So all of that was new, and they're standing up here telling us for the 4th time, here's the new development model for SharePoint. We're all like, oh yeah, whatever. How long is this going to last?
Yeah.
CSOM, JSOM.
Yeah.
SPF.
So how long did it after the initial shock of this is how we're going to do it now? How long did it take you to really get comfortable?
Well, probably 3 months. 3 months of like really working in it and just working incrementally, understanding bit by bit by bit, and working to understand each of the bits of tooling. You don't really need to understand all the bits of tooling, but until you understand all the bits of tooling, you don't necessarily know you don't need to understand all the bits of tooling. So it was an incremental process of like wrapping my brain around each bit of it. Because I mean, Visual Studio, it does so much that you don't think about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in the Node environment, you are managing all of those pieces of that build pipeline that you just don't think about when you're in Visual Studio. So I'd say about 3 months. And I do remember when I made the switch to TypeScript. This is another AC conversation. He was working on his SharePoint Framework course, and I was chatting with him, and he was like, you're going to learn TypeScript? Okay, take notes and let me know what all the hard things were. And I remember literally just saying, I am doing this now. Everything I write from this point on is going to be TypeScript. And it took me 3 days of like painful like research and figuring it all out. But at the end of 3 days, I was like, oh, okay, this is actually more like C# than I thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
And now that I've wrapped my brain around all that and gave him my 7 pages of notes to AC about how all the questions I had about TypeScript, that I've now like gone, oh, you moron, that was not a smart question. That happened. So
Jason is here. There we go.
Yep.
And all I heard was AC was being lazy. That's what I got out of that. Was that right? Did I get it right?
Jason, you and I know that is pretty standard.
Sorry, work ran long.
It happens.
So I often used to tell people when we were getting started in this whole thing and introducing SPFX that if you'll give it 5 days, right, sat behind the keyboard, cranking out some solutions, right, doing it hands-on with TypeScript, on about the 3rd or 4th day, it's going to click in your head and you're going to go, oh, this is just strongly typed JavaScript.
Yes.
Right? That's it.
Yeah, the TypeScript switch.
Anything different.
100% that is the case. Once you like get over that shock of like, just, okay, it's any, all right?
Well, and the tool chain obviously is a big scary part of this whole thing about having to manage all that and learn all these things. But if you take it back to 2003 and 2007 development, right, where we were having to do, diamond directive files and manage the packaging all ourselves and write the manifest, and then we got VisiWiz that sort of automated that process for you. And next thing you know, the tool is doing it all for us in the background. It's really not all that different. It's just as you say, we have to manage the tools in the toolbox a little more hands-on than we did in the past.
Yep, that's exactly the right thing. It's just they're all brand new tools all at the same time, and it's quite overwhelming. And if you don't know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and you don't have that perseverance mindset and really want it, it can be very daunting and sort of stop you in your tracks.
So by process of this is the only option that you now have, whereas we used to have lots of options, right?
Right.
Microsoft, I guess, claims SPFX is successful. There's no other way to do it, so it would have to be, right? But in thinking back of we used to have lots of ways to do it, right? Now we've narrowed down to really only one way to do it. Where do you think Microsoft has gotten it right in this sort of fourth iteration of SharePoint development?
Well, I think that there is, when you're talking SharePoint Online, I think there is a vast disconnect between the IT staff and how they used to feel empowered over their hardware and their sort of software systems versus I'm now IT admin manager of an online SaaS product. And so one of the things that I think is that I find with some clients, not all clients, it's interesting because you have this complete dichotomy. You either get a client who is like, oh, okay, I've just hired you. You haven't even signed an NDA. I'm going to give you a global administrator access and go ahead, do whatever you think is right. To the other client who is like, no, we have virtual desktop with a VPN to get to Microsoft 365. And you're like, really? I have to jump through 2 VPNs just to get to a cloud product. God, so like there's so much difference.
Definitely understood the assignment.
Yes. There's so much difference in that I think the ability for a developer to write a solution and then deploy it into SharePoint in a way that sort of handles that for them, and there is no global admin access for that. It's like you give them a package, they put the package in the right spot, assuming they don't give you, the developer, access to that right spot. That makes that easier, right? So that's significantly easier. There's some Rails there. There's the API. I mean, if you don't know any better, there's the API authentication for the graph ones. You guys know why I'm laughing. And so, I think it streamlines that. So from that perspective, for especially small to medium-sized companies who are like, Azure, what the hell is that? No, you can't put anything in Azure. I don't want anything in Azure. I don't understand Azure. I don't want to pay for Azure. That's not a thing. So to be able to get customizations into those organizations, that's powerful. I think one of the misses, and something I didn't really understand early, is that you can do Teams development, which is a provider-hosted solution. You can bring those solutions into the Teams environment using Teams manifests and whatever, but it's, I don't think, broadly known that you can also bring those same type of provider-hosted apps into SharePoint pretty simply as well. And so I don't think that, so you actually have 2 ways to get things into SharePoint or Teams. And certainly the provider hosted version of that is much more tailored. You can tailor that to your organization and your development sort of mindset.
And funnily enough, a lot of that resides on the app model. So sort of, V3 of development, we couldn't really do a lot of this stuff without the underpinnings of the app model.
Right. Yep.
Which you and I were early, along with our fellow cohorts, early in adopting and espousing and talking about, and this and that and the other, and then of course they switch gears, went a different direction, as they always do.
Yeah.
One of the things, bringing Paul into the conversation a bit here, that has been helpful about this switch, where Microsoft unusually followed what the greater development community was doing rather than trying to chart their own path, is that it's actually made it easier to, when we had to start building Salesforce solutions, because the jumping into the CLI and whatnot, it's the same tool set, right? It's the same node-based delivery mechanism, right, with their own command line. So now that we're used to working with PnP.js and the O365 CLI and all the extra add-on tools that are all command line, we can argue modern, right? When we went UI, and then we've gone all the way back to 1965, right? We're writing everything in the command line in Unix style. But in any event, it made that transition to the Salesforce process easier for me because I understood that whole tool set. Paul, did you have that same experience? Of course, you kind of lived in both worlds at the same time. But.
So, yeah, most of my world was figuring out how to put my text-based JavaScript code into different platforms. So I was embedding in those web content, SharePoint web parts, and then I found a way just to do that in Salesforce as well. So I was always very much hijacking the UI or injecting JavaScript into the UI from flat files. So there's definitely I'm still not quite caught up. There is a huge part of Node.js development that's now done style called Lightning Web Components, and that's a whole branch of Salesforce development that is almost 100% the Node pattern for doing dev. So it's both sides. I don't live very much in that Node world. I never got into. I crashed and burned whenever you had to do the Git installs and the Node.js installs just to I can open Notepad, I can write code. Why am I jumping through all these hoops? And so I failed a little bit on that, and just found a way to hack my code in and mostly write it as prototype and lead teams with prototypes that know how to do it the right way and have gone through and gotten all those scars the right way. But yeah, it's every platform I've been on or been exposed to seems to have that pattern of development now.
Well, and it's extending out into a lot of other platforms as well. And I know it shocks Jason to the core when I praise Microsoft for doing something right. But this shift has actually been very beneficial. When we went to deploy code on a new platform, we went to build our Zapier integration for Power Tools. Here I was right back in the same Node.js base, put in a few NPM packages, install a CLI. I'm back to doing manifest files and stuff. It's almost exactly the same thing that I'm doing, whether I'm developing for Office or Salesforce or these other platforms. Are there nuances? Yes, of course. Are there different, the deployment models are different. It's totally different way of getting things into Salesforce and Office 365. But this transition, I think, has been a good one overall, even though, like Julie, I write all my backend code in ASP.NET, right? Do a ton of Azure development, right? It's MVC and Azure functions and whatnot, but it's still C# at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
So you get kind of foot in both worlds to make that happen. What for those who are still out there that are coming, especially from the enterprise, where it's all traditional server-side development, and just in case by some miracle anybody from Vesta's team is listening, yes, I still spend most of my time in Visual Studio, just so you know, and you will never pry my IDE out of my cold dead hands. But what would Julie, what would be your advice to those folks who are looking to make the transition into this really weird, different world of this whole JavaScript based client side dev? Where do they need to begin, and what do they need to do?
I think they need to have, so I always tell everyone, go take AC's course, Voitano's course on the SharePoint framework, because nobody has done it better. Nobody has put it together in a way that is so digestible and thorough as he did. So that's absolutely the right place to start. If you are a C# Visual Studio, ASP.NET, type person, and you're like, wait, what? That's the place you got to start, because he's going to explain all that tooling, get your environment set up properly, whatever, and then break down the SharePoint framework. And now you can take that as far as you want too, right? Like you can learn just that much, and then you can be like, okay, well now I understand like the Node environment and the tooling and whatever. Learn TypeScript. Maybe you can use like front end masters or some other Pluralsight or whatever it is to learn TypeScript. But that's kind of like, if you listen to any podcasts or blogs, read blogs or whatever on just pure web development, not having anything to do with Microsoft 365. I listened to a few different podcasts on that subject. They talk a lot about the fact that TypeScript has taken over many of those tools. So, you got to learn that TypeScript. And actually, coming from C#, way easier to learn TypeScript if you don't know JavaScript. I think the thing that made the transition from JavaScript to TypeScript hard is if you know JavaScript already and you're like used to sort of doing these shortcuts, then moving to TypeScript is very hard. If you're coming from C#, you're like interfaces, check, like enums, check, like all those things you're used to, very easily mapped, like very similar. So I think from that perspective, if you're going to do Microsoft 365 development, you're in an enterprise and you're just getting up and running, you go to AC's class and you get started that way. Then you got to make some serious architectural decisions, in my opinion. Because like I said a little earlier, you don't have to build everything with the SharePoint framework. You could build everything with like a Teams app type of provider hosted solution or whatever. And you've got to decide where you're going to put your time and effort. I ironically have a new client who is on SharePoint 2010, and they deployed web services and pretty much rewrote the entire front end of SharePoint with their own custom web services that they host in the Hive. And they're like, yeah, we want to move to SharePoint Online. We can just drag and drop this stuff, right?
Sure.
You can drag it and drop it right in the bin.
Yeah, I mean, it's a moment, and they were pretty overwhelmed and shocked. They're like, wait, what do you mean? I can't. I'm like, none of those. You are writing against the SharePoint server object model. You can't. None of this is going to work. You don't have any client object model code that I can even help you get like that. That's even close. All of these calls will have to be rewritten. So, I mean, that's overwhelming. And so we sort of started talking about stuff, and then they're like, yeah, you're right. We got to just take one little bit at a time. We got to sort of rethink this whole thing. So
they weren't using SOAP and Camel. They were doing object model stuff.
Yeah.
It would be worse if they were using SOAP and Camel.
So I want to echo Julie's sentiment about AC's course. I wouldn't know a TypeScript from a Sanskrit, but what I can tell you is, as an IT pro back in my SharePoint days, and they're happily behind me, I did take AC's course up to a certain point, specifically for that reason of trying to understand how the environments are put together and how all of that stuff comes together. And even for a non-codie like me, it was extremely helpful to be able to get things started and have a base understanding. So if you're getting started, I can't agree with Julie more on that point. Before you start trying to parse through it on your own, and whether, granted, I will admit bias on this. I'm a friend of Andy McCollum, been watching his courses since the very beginning, even again, as a non-dev, but find that path that works for you, but make sure that you find that ground level to get started with, because if you don't have it and you try and just jump in midstream, things get ugly because it's not the same. To your point,
you'll end up making
it's a different thing. And when I say drop it in the bin, I don't mean the whack bin. I'm talking about the recycle bin. So just to be very, very clear. So
plus you'll end up making, every time you start something new, this is not like a diss on anybody, but anytime you start something new and you do one thing and then you're like, oh, okay, I learned a whole bunch of stuff. And then you do it again, and you're like, oh, okay. And then you do the third time, and you're like, oh, okay. And then you go back and look at the first one, and you go, please don't show that to anyone. I don't want anybody to know about that first thing I did. Like, if you don't have that grounding, you have so much more levels of mistakes you're going to go through before you get to something like worthy of being out there, that, you know what I mean? You don't want to spend that time. You don't want to waste that time learning that whole platform that way.
So since we've mentioned it about 27 times, we're going to have to make AC a sponsor here. I think you can go and check out the Voitanos development courses at voitanos.io and get all of. I don't know how much he's got out there.
Do we have our
for him? But I did it anyway.
So I guess we're going to have AC on at some point.
There you go. That's the answer.
Where's our referral link that we have set up there?
Yeah, exactly.
I have one of those.
So I'll also drop it in the notes for the show in the description for people who are interested in going and checking that out. But Jason, let's loop back to your point for a minute, because you, although you're not really in the SharePoint space at all anymore, you still deal with a lot of enterprise customers, large enterprise customers who are having to make this transition. Probably most of your customers are in the cloud, at least hybrid at the moment. But there has to be a fair amount of discussion that happens about how they upskill and they move into the cloud native process from where they've traditionally been.
Yeah, completely agreed. And granted, my customers being at Microsoft now are all in the cloud because that's where we're living. And being in the business intelligence space, that Power BI is the way and the light. But we do have a lot of folks who are still in on-premises, SQL Server, on-premises analysis services, on-premises reporting services, and things of that nature. And how do you migrate? How do you move? How do you rethink all of those things where you always had these dedicated environments, and now you're moving into a SaaSified world for a lot of what we do. The Power BI world is a SaaS world, So, and part of it is that we're providing more migration paths and more guidance on the topic, but it's not, it's always the standard Microsoft thing, right? We do an 80% job and we leave a job for the community, for the SB market to go off and do. At least that's the easy way of explaining it. You can call it whatever you want, lazy. I try to be highly efficient. It's not laziness; it's highly efficient. There's room for others to come and play, right? But beyond that, just finding the way to move into this new world. There's a lot of free education out there, and there's a lot of paid conferences happening out there. I will drop this in, and Eric, I don't know if you have the ability to put this link out there. Build.microsoft.com is coming up. I think it's going to be at the same time that some of us are going to be in Germany. But why is a Power BI guy talking about Build, which is traditionally a developer conference? Watch and find out.
Inquiring minds want to know.
I'm saying it might be something worth paying attention to. For the first time in my history, I'm going to be watching that like a hawk. And if I wasn't going to be in Germany at the best conference on the planet, I would probably be out in Seattle instead. But I'm going to be with the awesome conference in Germany instead. So, which I'm sure that we have a link for that one as well for collabsummit.eu. But what I will say is get out there and start looking at these different methods of going to the cloud, because there's so much great stuff happening. A lot of what we're focused on, I just finished, part of the reason why I'm running behind in making it here today, and I apologize for that, was because we had an all hands this morning talking about what's coming next. And, Microsoft works in semester plans and hearing all the cool stuff that we're doing between now and the end of this year. It's really cool.
Does it have an API?
Lots of them.
Better have
an awful lot of them. Are there enough? Probably not. But there are lots of them. However, and I did hear that you were looking for a T-shirt that said that somewhere. So
my goal for 2023 is to be the most annoying person to Microsoft about the fact that there is missing APIs for features and there's not both app and delegated permissions for everything. That's my goal for 2023.
Amen. Behind you 100%.
I think that's
so sick of getting burned
thing to be asking for. My customers ask that question on a regular basis, which being as it's my job to take the voice of the customer back to our engineering teams, I'm always happy to hear that question because it's an important one. And the API surface is not quite enough. There's always more opportunity there.
I think the worst part about it is it's not that it's not quite enough. That's bad. But the worst part is it's falling behind. Features are coming out. More and more features keep coming out. And the API surface is almost stagnant. If not stagnant, really damn close to stagnant. And it's insanely annoying.
Whereas
future session with Julie, API-driven design.
API-driven
design patterns.
It was the other way around. Everything was built in the product around the object model, right? They didn't do anything that didn't evoke the object model. So, okay, there were some classes and things that were protected and we couldn't get to, but for the most part, you could do everything exactly the way that they did. I remember having the argument over and over back in the day when I was the only person talking about site definitions and how you can build site definitions, and them saying, no, you shouldn't do that. Well, it's exactly the same way that the product team does it, right? This is exactly how the product is built, right? Just because it's big and gnarly, don't be afraid of it. But anyway, so one of the challenges that we used to have was this really steep learning curve in getting effective as a developer, because you had to know the product and the platform and all this stuff. Just to get a development machine required installing SharePoint and AD and all this stuff that you had to do. Yeah. Certainly a lot of those have gone away with client-side development, which is a great thing. But I think it's a bit of a misnomer to say that all you have to learn is the CLI and the development stack, right? There's still a lot of stuff people need to know.
Yeah, 100%. You can't build a good solution on top of Microsoft 365 if you do not understand the landscape you are building on top of, what each of those pieces are, what they do well, what they don't do well, how to leverage them, how to finagle them when out of the box isn't quite what you want. But if you know it really well, you can kind of put some Lego blocks together in a certain way. There is a deep need to understand the platform to write good solutions for it, in my opinion.
And some of that's a bit buried in the weeds of understanding things like identity management and authorization, like, I'm going to call a RESTful endpoint. Okay, are you going to do it through the graph, or are you going to call it directly, right? How are you going to authorize that? Are you invoking the OAuth yourself? Are you, what's an Azure AD app? Why do I need one of those, right? What are permission scopes, and why would I need to embed them in my call? And should they be fixed or dynamic, right? There's a whole lot of stuff lurking below the surface.
Can I just point out a thing that I've said to Paul Schaeflein about 400 billion times, that auth is not easy, and regardless of what he says, auth is not easy. Margaritas aside, auth is not easy.
Auth is not easy.
Hang on. When I go and start coding and I just open the browser to ChatGPT and I ask it to give me all these, are you telling me it's not going to just automatically know all that stuff?
That's what we're telling you.
That's exactly.
Sorry, I couldn't help it. I had to.
You know what ChatGPT is great for? Getting Julie and I hired. That's what it's great for.
Yeah, when the code does not work at all.
So please, everyone, keep using it.
Yeah, keep thinking that it's going to replace some developers. We'll see.
At JFJ 1997 when it gets back.
Yeah, exactly.
DM me. I had to do it. I don't know if you guys had already made that joke earlier in the show or not, but it has to be done at least once at this point every show. So.
There's lots of places where, I'll pick up on your point, Jason, of where Microsoft sort of goes part way and doesn't quite get all the way there. That for good intentioned or otherwise, where they start to do something and it just sort of stalls or doesn't quite get there. And one of those, I'm teeing up a big softball for Julie right now, and is Office UI Fabric, right? Which is a great idea.
Yes.
And a great development. I don't even want to call it a pattern, but it's a great helper for people just getting started, and that you just want to build things quickly, but it goes off the rails soon when you get started and fails to meet a lot of things. So in response, as typically happens in the community, as Jason said, people have stepped up to help solve that problem. And Julie is part of a community effort called H2O, HTWOO. Tell us a little bit about that, Julie.
Yeah, so I have been working with a fellow MVP and brilliant design mind, Stefan Bauer. He's out of Austria, Vienna, Austria, and he is pretty much one of the best HTML and CSS designers that I've ever encountered. Like, he just knows this stuff so cold. And so we've been working together for quite a long time. We started together working on Microsoft's 365 learning pathways. If anyone's familiar with that, it's he and I built that together for Microsoft. And that's sort of when we first started collaborating and building these things together. And the having that design expertise of HTML and CSS with development expertise, client-side development expertise, is like a marriage made in heaven that I didn't know I wanted to be in. You know what I mean? Like, as far as work husbands go, the best work husband ever, because it's this symbiosis between, hey, show me what this is going to look like in HTML and CSS, make it all responsive, make it beautiful. I don't want to know any of that. And then you give me that pattern, and I'm going to make all the buttons work and the data load into it and all of those kinds of things. And once you have that working relationship, man, you can develop fast. Really, really fast we can go as far as like building solutions. So go, fast forward, we're working together, whatever, and Office UI Fabric React, all of the different incarnations of what essentially is Microsoft's Fluent Design language, which is actually very good and very robustly defined. The implementations of their components were not. They had no well, they did at one point, but then they dropped support for their pure HTML, JavaScript, CSS JavaScript implementation of their components. They do have a React component library, but it's very tricky to extend. Like, it's not really very flexible. And then they keep introducing new kind of variations on it, and they're not compatible with each other. So, okay, you go to the next major version and you literally have to rewrite your whole application. And so Stefan and I got very frustrated with that. And on one of those, like, How I Met Your Mother challenges, literally, I think it was Vesa Juvonen who might have said something like, oh, well, Stefan can do that in a weekend or whatever. And he did. So essentially, he took the Microsoft Design framework and he wrote a pure HTML and CSS implementation of that. And he called it H2O Core. And that is then open source and free to use. So once we had that base implementation, then I was like, okay, well, we're gonna use this in the projects that we do together. So he had built something called a Pattern Labs is a product that Brad Frost, who's a very famous designer in the web design world, had put out this idea of atomic design for websites. And the idea is that every piece of your website is built on each other. So you have a text box and it's styled in a certain way, and that's an atom in your overall design. And then you take, a text box and a label and a button and you put it together, and now you have a molecule that is in your design. And then you can reuse these components, and you just think of it like Legos, right? And so we took that methodology and we made a React component library that we could use in don't put stuff in the chat and distract me. I'm trying to talk about something. Brat. So we just put all of those components together and then started building things for clients with that. And so as we build things for clients, the library got bigger and bigger and bigger. And we were like, well, we have to open source this so that everybody else can take advantage of the greatness. And so ironically, right now, as we speak, we are about to release a new major version of H2O. It doesn't change much as far as implementation, like from a user's perspective, using the library, it's not going to be a major shift, a few little minor things, but the underlying tooling for SaaS is going to be upgraded, and some stuff is going to be done in a more modern way. So postmodern too. And so yeah. So it's been a fun project, and I think it makes design. I mean, one of the tenets of the React components that I built was that I wanted each one to be supremely extensible. Like, you need to have complete access to the component itself, so that you can add your own standard attributes and events to each of the HTML elements right out of the box.
And for those who want to get some more information on that, you can jump over to the About H2O. I'll put a banner up here for it, so you can get a link and go check that out. But Julie, this is something anybody can add to their projects if they're building on Teams or any of the M365 stack, right?
Any of the M365 stack or outside of the M365 stack. Full disclosure, because it's great HTML and CSS and it has some features that I needed, I have it in my blog. My blog uses some of the elements of H2O. So you can use it in anything you want to use it in. And I've done the best we can to create like some helper functions and stuff like that to make theming really easy, and to just, things we'd want as developers when we build our solutions. We've tried to add all of that rich feature to the library itself.
So folks might be asking, well, why do I need this? When I'm building solutions, aren't I writing JavaScript anyway? And React components are already there, which is all true. But React components don't come styled, right? They're pretty ugly, and they don't work together very well, especially from a styling perspective. And if you've never had CSS clash in React, and you haven't been doing enough React, right? It's a mess. And when the Office fabric, not to diss it, but the Office fabric is in many places creaking around the edges and needs some help in some of the controls and the way they've been implemented, and it hasn't caught up a lot. And if you're just straight, I did some sample code just for a customer recently, just to show them how something could be done, in their migration to the cloud and whatnot, just very basic demo type stuff. And I got caught up on doing an adaptive card thing and this, that. And I thought, this is exactly why Julie and Stefan did this, because there's just too much conflict here. I should have been done with this 30 minutes ago, and I'm still fighting for this to get these stupid styles to match.
Yeah. And then there's another aspect to it too. And I'm not actually dissing on Microsoft what I'm about to say, but their HTML and CSS in the product, like the SharePoint product and the Teams product, although that's less of a situation, but certainly the SharePoint product, where you're putting web parts right in the page and you're sort of part of the DOM then, is not as advanced as it could be. And so you end up with some responsiveness that isn't the best that it could be, because they do some of the stuff with JavaScript that you can do with CSS and blah, blah, blah. And they're just dealing with technical debt. So I think we all recognize that you can't switch that as fast as you can as a developing, a brand new little web component. And so one of the things we definitely focus on is making sure that as much of the functionality is in the HTML and CSS. So you're not writing a ton of JavaScript to do animations or responsiveness or any of that kind of stuff. You want to minimize that, because CSS is processed by the graphic processing unit in your computer, not by the CPU. And so by doing a lot of that work in CSS and not JavaScript, you get much better performance. Like, it just ends up being a much better looking solution.
Have they started doing, there's been a little bit of virtualization, and the components that you write in LWC, they've got a locker service, and they pass things through a DOM interpreter, to where when you're writing components, you're bringing it in, and there's a security layer that your JavaScript code is actually having to pass through before it's passed straight to the DOM, and it dereferences a lot of the elements and tries to secure it so that unsecure code can't have full access to the DOM.
Okay.
Or new code or mildly trusted code. Has H2O or Microsoft built anything that's kind of similar, just to have a synonym down?
I don't know of anything personally. I can't say that I do.
Now you're drifting into the React space. I mean, that's a fair bit of what React does in abstracting the DOM. And of course, it's not the only solution out there, but it's really not looked at from a security perspective, right?
Yeah.
It's just all about rendering and managing the DOM and whatnot.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of an equivalent. There may be some kind of equivalency out there. I've looked enough at the LWC to kind of understand what it's doing and how that works and why they're implementing it that way. But I think that's a Salesforce specific implementation there that from a broader perspective, I'm not sure anyone's focused on.
Yeah.
It seems like they were headed that way with SharePoint web parts for a little bit, that you could have web parts that were brought in that kept their brains on another system.
Isolated web parts.
Cross-site scripting. Yeah,
it's isolated web parts, and that's still a thing, and you can still do it. The actual problem with isolated web parts, and I think part of why there's an adoption issue there, is because they're rendered in an iframe in the web part paradigm. So you have a DOM element on the page that is for your web part, and essentially they'd render an iframe, and then your web part would render inside that iframe. Now, that's a great security paradigm, and especially the sort of half joke that I made before about like the API surface. One of the it's a security hole. Let's just be honest. One of the security holes of SharePoint framework is that if you say, okay, my component needs access to the graph files whatever endpoint, and then you request that as part of your manifest, as soon as the admin approves that API, any SharePoint framework solution in your tenant now has access to that. Like, that's just how it works, because that's how the security is set up. There's only one app registration. They're essentially adding that app role to that service principal, and so that's what you get. Isolated web parts, on the other hand, don't have that, right? Because that iframe is in a different domain is the word that's popping into my head, but that's not the right app. Thank you. And so thereby, you have some security boundaries. The problem is that the iframe styling in the SharePoint page is done wrong. And so that the iframe is not responsive. So people said, oh yeah, this isolated web part, let me do that. And then they're like, oh, but it's so ugly, it doesn't respond right. And this is actually back to a Stefan thing. We were talking about isolated web parts. He's like, oh, the only problem is they're not styling. Iframes can be responsive. I'm like, they can? How do you do that? Because of course I don't know that shit about CSS. So I'm like, so fix it. And so he literally spent a few hours and he's like, this is how they should fix the CSS for the iframe and the isolated web part, and then it'd be fine. So cool. Okay, but we can't do that. We don't have access to do that on the SharePoint page, so we can't fix it. But then you've lost that power that you had. You could have had these isolated web parts and it would have been a good thing. So sorry, that was a really long answer to your comment.
So we've mentioned this a couple times. Let's go ahead and put it out there, since 3 of the 4 of us are going to be there. And that is the European Collaboration Summit coming up in Dusseldorf in May. Where
I'm so excited. It's my first time.
Julie will be there. And Julie, you have a couple of sessions. I know you're doing some stuff with the P&P team on the all-day thing, but then you have your own session where I think you're talking about atomic design principles.
Yes, that's my session. It's atomic design principles with H2O, and I'm gonna basically go through and explain to you how to build up your solutions with the SharePoint with H2O in the SharePoint framework. So you'll get to see how that whole process works, and then how to also build your own components. So you can kind of cobble things together in different ways and build your own user interface. And I'll be, sort of giving the history of this whole thing and how to think about it. So we're going to use the SharePoint framework, but it's not really a Microsoft specific talk in that way. Like, you can use these principles and this library in any solution that you're building.
And Jason, you and John have your typical pre-conference. Do you there for?
I would assume so. I thought I was.
Love that he doesn't know.
I thought I was doing a session called "How to Plan a Bar Mitzvah" because that's what I've been working on lately.
It'll be a big draw for that.
Yeah. So especially in Germany, I think it's that maybe of interest. Because hey, it's a cool thing to do. But it's I don't remember. I think we have at least one other session, and I don't know what we're doing off the top of my head. But if I had to guess, I'll probably update it between now and then anyway, because we've got a lot of cool stuff we're doing right now. So there's some fun things happening in the Power BI space.
So during the pre-conference day, where unfortunately people will have to choose between Jason and John and Julie and Vesa and the gang, you'll be doing some stuff with the P&P team. What are you doing over in part of that?
Yeah, so we're breaking out into each one of us is going to do a different section. So my section is with my coworker, Derek Cash-Peterson, who's been doing a lot of work with the Viva. Oh my God, me and my brain some days. The Viva Connections dashboard little apps. And so he's been doing a lot with that. And obviously I do a ton with SharePoint Framework and whatever. So my area, I'm going to cover like a 200, 300 level SharePoint Framework discussion. So, I'm going to definitely be, because it's my style, I'm going to be throwing out tips and tricks, things that I run into that I'm like, hey, I found that this works like really good, but we're going to go a little bit deep. We're going to dive into some just great SharePoint Framework stuff and what you can do and the power and how you can make it behave exactly like you want to. I might even talk about external libraries because I like that. So we'll see.
Wow, getting crazy.
I'm going nuts, my friend, nuts.
If you've never had the pleasure of going to a
easy
session, highly recommend it. It's
always thank you.
You're a presenter. I really enjoy your stuff. Even when I only understand like a third of it because I'm not a dev. Like,
well, it's not as fun as presenting with Rackley, right?
That was a lot of fun, but DCP is awesome as well. So the two of you together will be a great thing.
We'll have a good
if you're
time.
into Power BI and you're interested, we are doing the workshop. I don't remember the other session that we're doing. It wouldn't matter anyway. It's going to be updated between now and then because we've done everything I have not been on the road to speak at a conference since December.
Wow.
And this will be the first time back out at a conference. So in 6 months, everything has changed, all the cool stuff. So there's lots of stuff to talk about. Yeah, heck, we've got a green theme now, like Power BI is green, like we're teal. Excuse me, we're teal.
Shocked! So, they changed an icon or a name.
Actually, no, the icon is still yellow. However, but there's so much new stuff that's why it doesn't matter. Whatever the thing says, I'll probably update it anyway. But it's going to be a great event. Get out there and come see us.
Well, we made light of it a little bit earlier, but really, this is one of the best shows of the year. It's easy to get to from the States. Just fly into Frankfurt and hop over to Dusseldorf or Amsterdam and hop to Dusseldorf, London, wherever you want to connect through. The price of the flight and the show is less than the ticket to go to most conferences. So you definitely want to come join us. For folks who haven't been there, once you come and join us, you'll realize why European Collaboration Summit is such a big deal and why we all enjoy going over there on our own dime to make it happen.
Well, I'm excited for you guys to show me all the sites and get me up to speed since it's my first
Have
trip.
no fear. You will be in ham knuckle heaven before you know it.
I love me a meat platter.
Wine or beer, do you?
No. I've never known Julie to be into those things.
Right, Jason.
No. And if you don't have budget to be able to get over to an in-person conference or your comfort level is not there, build.microsoft.com. You should be taking a look at it. There's going to be some good stuff happening there. But if you can get out to an in-person conference, come see us. It's going to be awesome.
Be the one to go to. Well, sadly, that is pretty much all the time that we have this month. I just want to finish with a couple of our housekeeping things. Don't forget to join us the second Thursday of every month for Winging It with myself and Rob Bogue on the same channel, where we typically take a trip down memory lane and talk about all the old school stuff. And you can see the scars. They're brilliantly lit up all over the screen of they're deep. They run deep. And we talk about and it's cathartic. And then we talk about the new stuff too. And then the last Thursday of every month, talking about new stuff, is Paul's vNext series, where more of a focus on Salesforce, but also cross-platform development and multi-cloud and lots of things that we do over on vNext. And this is less about us old guys with gray beards talking about stuff we did 20 years ago. And more about the new and upcoming stuff that's happening in the future, as it were. So we've got some great content coming up for that. So be sure to check that out the fourth Thursday. So at present, it's only the first Thursday we don't have any content. And I'm sure we'll rectify that soon, even if it's just the three of us sitting around the water cooler talking about nothing important. Once again, thanks to all of our sponsors, Aptigent. You can catch the Bifocal podcast with Jason and John White at bifocal.show. And if you are in the DFW area, or if you want to see it virtually, you can sign up at Trailblazer. You can go and just create an account. You can join these community groups and see Paul's Salesforce developer group. By hopping over and checking that out, which is the third Wednesday of each month. Do I have that right?
Fourth Wednesday of every month. And apparently we will be at the Texas Dreamin' up here in a couple weeks. I'll have to get that link out to everybody and the date, which I don't know off the top of my head, but apparently I'm going. Just found out.
All right. Great stuff. Well, Julie, thank you so much for doing this with us. We really appreciate it. taking your time out. And we super look forward to seeing you in Germany here in a couple months and giving you a proper tour of Dusseldorf, or at least the parts we know. I'm sure there's a better tour, but
so the bar crawl is what we're doing.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Got it.
But we have meetings at each of the bars, though.
Right. Yes.
Otherwise,
they're very important. Not to be missed. Mandatory.
All right.
Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it, and we'll see you